Hello, everyone. Let's get started with this afternoon's speaker. The speaker this afternoon is Amory Harris. She's the president of the Reno Rose Society, and she's going to be talking to us about, the topic is roses, fire, and ice, an exploration of how roses came to be and got pushed around by Mother Nature. She'll also explain the mysterious explosion in rose distribution and variability starting 20,000 years ago.
Thank you. It's great to be with you here. Good to see some familiar faces. I'm going to get rid of this. That's another story for another time with more roses. My topic today is roses, fire, and ice. Roses are related to fire and ice, and not in the way that you would normally think so. This story started because Richard and I had gone off to do a tour of all the stands last fall, trekked through Central Asia, and we found out that apples and roses, for the most part, are very much native and growing wild all over Kazakhstan. So with that in mind, I went, oh, how did this happen? And I came up with a set of questions. How old are roses anyway? You heard me answer the question earlier today. 35 million years, but we'll get to that later. Why are roses native only to the northern hemisphere? Another question that's interesting. And also, why are there so many different roses out there? To begin with, roses are very, very old, but then so are plants. Plants go back 470 million years. Conifers go back to about 350 million years. Blooming flowers, angiosperms, because that's what roses belong to, go back another couple hundred million years. Then we go back to our favorite family, the rose family. This isn't just roses. This is apples, believe it or not, peaches. Go back an astounding 65 million years. This is based on a fossil record. It's also based on pollen records because we can identify plants by the pollen that they leave behind. Here we're looking at on the left, prunus from North America, my favorite continent, and a modern prunus structure. Someone's cut this in section. You can see the same structures here. You can see, where are we? The pistil in both, and you can see the ovaries down here. But this is basically rose family from the very beginning. And here are the first documented rose fossils. They're, again, from North America, from near the Rocky Mountains, between there and the Oregon coast. What we mostly have are leaves, very few flowers. Rose fossils are very, very rare, and scientists who study ancient plants tend to ignore this particular group of plants. You can read a lot of scientific journals, because I tried to track these down, and they go on about the Acer, Ulmus, Betula, Pinus, Suga, all the rest of the trees, and they totally ignore one of my favorite plants. And as you can see here, the fossils that we see from 35 million years ago look very similar foliage-wise to several modern roses, and they're thought to be closely related. And those roses are from North America. Here are blooming examples of those roses. 5 petals, like most species roses, because we're talking about wild roses, species roses, where all the other roses came from. They're usually once blooming. I think you heard that earlier today. Most of these early plants are winter hardy. This is an interesting thought. We'll come back to that later when we run roses up and down mountainsides. Here's the natural distribution of roses according to Kruseman. I don't think he's totally correct. I would argue that there have been some introductions by man into some of the areas you can see down here in Africa and India. I don't think they were there but then that's my opinion, and I have no scientific basis for this whatsoever. Maybe later. And how did they become limited to the northern hemisphere? That's where I turn to the first part of the story, roses and fire. At one time, about 200 million years ago, we had two oceans, the Pacific and the Tethys, and we had basically one landmass. You can see North America here, Africa, South America, India, interesting location, Antarctica, Australia, and Europe, part of Europe is up in this area, connected by a very narrow land bridge. China is kind of isolated by itself. So how did that end up being our present configuration? We looked at plate tectonics. How many of you have read about the African Rift Valley? Anyone? It's a continent that's splitting apart. There's volcanism here in the center. It's shoving out the continental masses, and as that happens, you end up developing a seaway. Hence our continental separation by waterways. There we go. And for most of you who don't or aren't aware of it, roses do not swim. They do not, even the seeds don't tolerate salt water all that well. So what we have here after the continental landmass, the one landmass split up, is we have a seaway running, separating, notice South America, Africa, India, Australia, Antarctica. Okay, we're at 50 million years. What's happening at 35 million years? Roses. So right now we have a separation of the land masses. There's also an issue of what in the world's happening with all that extra crust. As you shove out these seafloors, you've got all this material. It has to go somewhere. Well, it goes one of two places. It either gets overridden by another continental landmass. Here we are looking at South America overriding the Pacific plate, and you've got volcanoes and you have the Andes. You also have this same activity going on in Japan. Same thing. You also have a similar business going on where you have a spreading ridge. Iceland sits on one of these. And you see constant volcanism along these ridges. That's the fire part of our story, because fire has driven separation of continents and also the creation of mountains in areas that would not otherwise have mountains. There's another type of plate collision. That's where nothing gets overridden, everything scrunches up, and here we are with the Himalayas. A huge, huge plateau and mountain range that creates a tremendous physical barrier to any kind of animal or plant migration. Here we are, 14 million years, and roses have started here in North America. There's still the isolation by the seaway. For those of you who always thought roses originated in Southern Europe, well, here's Southern Europe, it's an island. I don't think so. Scientists have been able to find, if you look at the red arrows up here, fossil remains from this time period, we're talking about 14 million years ago, all over Asia and into Europe. Notice we're north of that island of Southern Europe. There are roses over here 14 million years ago, and not much else. That's it. That's primarily the extent of what I was able to find in the scientific records. Second part of the story, because fire can only do so much in isolating roses to the northern hemisphere, we come to the story of ice and roses. If you have too much snow and ice, you don't get roses to grow very well. If you have no water, you get no roses. I think we can pretty well all agree on that one. So let's look at what was happening about 18,000 years ago. We have a band of deserts coming across here. Some jungle areas. You ever look at trying to compete with anything growing with bamboo and going across? So we've still got our isolation of roses to the northern hemisphere. We also have another little factor coming in. Look at the extent of the glacial continental ice masses. Roses aren't going to grow up there either. Here's our extent of native roses. This is where we think they were. There's also another thing, and that's why I'm wearing the hat today. Wolves and roses, the natural zone, happens to be very, very close together. Why is that? Perhaps that's a discussion for another day. Why are there so many different roses? Excuse me. I didn't quite finish the topic here. Yes, I did finish. Anyone debate have questions on why roses should be limited to the Northern Hemisphere? You all pretty well get that point? Okay, on to why are there so many different roses? Part of it is a change in habitat. If you look at the first fossil roses 35 million years ago, those are species roses. I'm sure since there was a wide number of different species identified, they had to have been older than that. Following the birth of roses, there was the episodic mountain building and changes in the landmass locations, changes in seaways, and hence precipitation patterns where there were deserts. There were also glaciation periods. And this says an interesting thing vertically with regard to where plants grow out in the wild. There's also competition with other plants. Grasses have not always been around. They are actually a fairly recent addition to the plant kingdom. They go back maybe 15 to 20 million years. So when they started to come into the scene, roses started to lose out. Bamboo, by the way, is a grass. Bamboo outcompetes roses. There's also the issue of what happened in the last 20,000 years. There are some other major changes that occurred, and I will get to that in a moment. Here's your hypothetical mountain scene. This would be today's picture of what the different zones look like. We've got permanent snow, alpine zone, got some montane regions, and here there should have been some grasslands, but there's not. And then here we have a higher precipitation area with all kinds of mixed trees. If you can imagine going back 35 million years ago, imagine all of this is being warmer, wetter, and the tree zone is up to here. Roses actually came from about in this zone. But what happened is as these continents bumped around, changed position, changed latitude, the plant communities had to move because the precipitation changed, the elevation on the mountainside changed. We had uplift, even here in California, the Sierras rose hugely and began to have snow. So the roses actually managed to spread down to the lowlands. And then as climate started to get more severe, harsh, we get glaciation, there were communities that got stranded up here that could survive that extra bit of cold. They could survive being in the snow. They could survive until the next spring. They had a short enough growing season capability to where they could produce seed, reproduce themselves. The same happened down in the lowlands. As these climate zones shifted up and down the mountainsides, you started creating these little odd pockets of roses that bloomed at different times. And then when things became more moderate, like they have in the last 20,000 years, some of the roses that were more tender were able to move back up onto the mountainsides because the growing seasons were longer. But what was interesting is they didn't interbreed with these species roses that had been left on the high mountainsides because their bloom dates were different. They weren't getting the pollen from one plant to the other. So we had a gazillion different species roses growing together in some of these warming up areas that couldn't interbreed because their bloom dates were different. So they weren't sharing pollen. So they were staying genetically isolated. So this is an important thing to look at later on when we wonder, why in the world are there so many species roses? There's another odd thing that started to affect roses. And you're looking at where the hell do we come from and how do we fit into this picture? We came out of Africa about 100 million years ago. If you notice here, there's the rose boundary. We didn't start hitting the rose zone until about 50,000 years ago. By then, we've got species roses spread all over the northern hemisphere, and they're different, diverse. And what do we do with roses when we encounter them? Well, that's an interesting question. I don't think there are any written records that I've found that indicate what the hell was going on then. But what I did find was the spread of farming. Mind you, this is not the spread of people invading other people. This is the spread of the idea of farming. People started farming here, told their neighbor over here, this is how you grow better wheat. And this idea spread through Northern Europe. Notice I'm Eurocentric here. And what's curious is here at 6,000 years, bear that date in mind. That's a very important date with regard to other things that are going on in the world. People are gathering at this time roses as food. I did not find a record saying, oh, we're having, roses with our dinner, we're having a beautiful arrangement, we're using them in funerary processions or anything like that. There really isn't that much of a fossil record, a preserved record, back from the early days. At least I wasn't finding it, and I did look pretty hard. Excuse me. Again, our 6,000-year boundary. Something was interesting, something different was being introduced to this area about 6,000 years ago, and that's because of trading. What we were finding in those parts of Europe, not only was the conveyance of the idea of agriculture and being able to plant something in the ground and coming back and harvesting it, there were also trade goods from over here in Afghanistan, mostly lapis lazuli, things like that, that ended up coming across land and ended up over in here in Europe and down here in Egypt, 6,000 years ago. But at this point, I still was not able to find a record of any hint of roses being used for anything other than food. And what we noted on our trip to Central Asia was people weren't cultivating these roses. They were going out and harvesting them in the wild. And as you can see here, this is a sales place on the side of the highway. These people were actually, I watched some of them going up into the hillsides here. Most of those are rose bushes, wild rose bushes. And they have these lovely hips, and they were harvesting the hips, and they were selling them to people who were driving by on their way to different other Central Asian capitals, and this is a food source. So this is what we saw in Central Asia. People don't grow these for hips out. Yes? The elevation, that was the high pass between Uzbekistan and Afghanistan. So what was that, about 5,800? No, it was higher than that. It was a fairly high pass that we went over. Yes? How do you eat them? I didn't like them. There were people sitting there nibbling the flesh off the hips, but most of what I could gather from semi-translating through someone else who spoke kind of Arabic, talking to one woman who's selling the quail and the roses together, because you got them together. You would use the rose hips to flavor the quail when you cooked them. And they also made teas and other medicinal things out of the rose hips. But they generally would strip off the flesh and then use it and cook it with something else. But then it's a good source of vitamin C, other things, and they had, I asked, how old is this recipe? And the woman told, this is through our friend from New York, June, said it was from before Alexander. Do you know Alexander? So this is an interesting side story. Richard went to another part of Central Asia. I couldn't go. And he saw one of the swords from Alexander's army. So Alexander was in this area, no question. And it was interesting to talk with these people about roses and what they did with them, particularly roses as food. But then I guess this is an old tradition. People have used whatever food they could gather and eat wherever they go. And rose hips continue to be harvested in the wild today in Central Asia. Well, there were, if you saw the picture I took, there had to have been at least 14 different varieties in there. I tried to separate them out, and she got really upset with me until I just paid her for the whole tray. And then she let me just play with it as much as I wanted, and then she was disappointed I left it all behind. But that's, what was I going to do with, it was a platter. About like that on the ground. And I just wanted to see what was in there. So it was really quite interesting. I thought I recognized some of the roses just from the hips. We were there in the fall. No blooms, nothing at all in bloom, except for the imported hybrid teas, etc., in the Soviet-style public gardens in the cities. There were very few roses out in people's yards. They just don't tend to grow roses that much, except I saw everybody had wild roses in their yard right around where they lived. For some, they're beautiful. They're absolutely stunning plants. Hips are beautiful in the fall. Anyway, back to the story. I continued looking for how far back can I bring the fossil record to meet the historical record. And I started finding comments about references to roses. No pictures so far. 2350 BC. First comment. This is Sargon I, taking over Turkey, writes about the roses there. It's inscribed on a mountainside. This is cool. I can live with that. That's nice. 1700 BC. We're looking at 5-petaled pink roses on a fresco. This is cool too. It's still not helping me tie together, I don't see the rose variations coming up very much yet. 1200 BC. All of a sudden we have a reference to Rosa gallica. First reference. This is more interesting. So we can trace at least that rose back to this region. Still not sure if it came from there because people really didn't care about where things came from then. 900 BC. The damask roses. This is where roses start to become more interesting to people, because all of a sudden you have a multi-petaled, super fragrant rose. Much more interesting. And the damask roses, as we've been told before, the source of a lot of the rose oil. So we start seeing literary references to the use of rose oil. 500 BC. Repeat blooming damasks. This is magic in the rose world and in the ancient world. These are the roses that the Romans highly prized. Believe it or not, I could not find any references to rose hybridizing. Nobody was apparently doing that, but they were talking about how to cultivate cuttings. If you found something you really, really liked, you took a gazillion cuttings of that plant and you rooted them and you made fields of roses. The Romans paid to cultivate fields and fields of roses so they could bring them back to Rome and do all kinds of celebratory things with rose petals, plus also making the rose oil. 450 BC, this is important, Rosa centifolia. That's the first reference to a hugely, hugely multi-petaled rose, and here it's stated to be 60 petals. I guess now we're talking about 100 petals. And as you can see down at the bottom, that's a coin from the island of Rhodes with a rose. I have those earrings somewhere downstairs. I didn't wear them today, but a lot of you have seen me wear those over the years. They're one of my most cherished items, and I imagine this image was very cherished back when It was first cast, not only for its beauty, but because it was solid silver. There we go, the Romans and roses. This is a later painting imagining what the rose was, used for back in Rome. Processions, used at feasts. They grew most of the roses in Egypt. Apparently, they would grow them up to a certain size, and then they would take them, roses, soil and all, and ship them to Rome in time for them to bloom so they could harvest the blooms and use them in whatever ceremonies, dinners, banquets that they had and ordered those roses for. And they spent, from what I could tell, millions and millions and millions of sesterces on growing roses in Egypt so they could bring them back to Rome just for this purpose. I thought it was totally outrageous. We think we've got bad habits. This is outrageous. Comment on our eastern part of the world. There's Confucius does have a comment on rose growing in China. There are some scholars who claim that commercial rose growing cultivation actually goes back to 7,000 years ago, but I'm kind of the mind, show me the records. I don't read Chinese, much less ancient Chinese, so I'm not sure about whether these claims are verifiable. It's just what I've read, mostly on the internet, and there's, to me, where's the science behind that? There is some science behind what the oldest preserved roses we have, and these are pressed roses. They're from a tomb in Egypt, recently excavated. So we do have dried roses from a tomb. This shows people really cared for these, and they were used as offering at burials. I would love to have found them earlier, like 30,000 years ago, but we've got no pollen evidence, unfortunately. 1200 AD, some interesting things are going on in the world. We have the Crusades. There are the first distinct domestic roses. This is where man starts interfering with what roses do. People start realizing you can take pollen from one plant and change things. They also start looking at accidental hybrids and propagating those. So we end up with a great number of albas, centifolias, damask, gallicas, and Scots roses from about this time period. And I've included here 1600 to 2010, we have rose mania, hybridizing rose mania, just like tulip mania, where individual tulips were going for $80,000, $90,000 in Europe. There are some roses that in the early days were going for outrageous amounts of money because they were so special, so unique. Today we just pay our patent fee and walk out of the grocery store or nursery and go on our way. Back in the early days, though, people in Europe who started this hybridizing mania started with a couple of different groups of roses, the European roses. These are listed here. Mostly singles, except for the ones down here at the bottom, the albas. Believe it or not, albas were first introduced to Great Britain by the Romans. I found two scientific, obscure references to that, and they were unreadable, so I'm not going to share them with you other than saying, yes, I believe that the Romans brought albas to Great Britain. Rosa gallica, which we saw references to, may or may not have been truly native to Southern Europe. Beautiful rose, spread all over Europe, source of a great hybridizing material later after 1200. The damask rose. This was brought back by the Crusaders primarily, and they started our route to madness and propagation into, I believe, what's over 30,000 different varieties now. Does anyone have an update on that? So 30,000 it stands. And I would have you go back and look at dogs. How many different kinds of dogs are there? How many different kinds of roses are there? Do you know where the different kinds of dogs come from? We did it. Do you know where most of the different kinds of roses came from? We did it. So with that, if it works, please enjoy the rest of the conference. This is one of my buds. And if you've got any questions, I'd be glad to take you on an odd historical venture. I'll try not to get too far afield. Yes?
When you were traveling, did you go with the intention of exploring, is how I asked the question earlier, sort of exploring evidence of roses in the early days? Was that the purpose of your travel, to try and...
Okay. I was just asked whether the purpose of our adventures in Central Asia was to explore where roses came from. The idea of exploring where roses came from was an accidental thought because we ended up in the foothills of the Himalayas in Kazakhstan, and there are all these wild apples and wild roses, and they're all different and wonderful. So I'm going, how did that happen? So I decided to find out. And by the way, the reason we were going to Central Asia was because Richard wanted to go to 100 different countries before he turned 65. So the trip to Central Asia got us a gazillion countries, and that almost pushed him over the edge. But we had to go back and do a cruise of the Baltic. So I have for a later talk rose gardens around the Baltic, including wild roses, rugoses, beautiful other things growing on the sand dunes and all manner of other places around the Baltic. Because Richard, when he set foot in Finland, reached 100 countries. Questions? Well, thank you again. I guess there's to be a district meeting starting shortly. No, no comment. But if you're interested later on in seeing some of the images from some of our other adventures, I do have them with me. And if you want to be bored to tears looking at roses later, fine with me. I'm happy to share. I love roses. I love telling people the wonderful things I've seen. Thank you.